Every time a fighter calls their UFC contract modern slavery, fans roll their eyes. But they shouldn't, because the exact business model running your favorite sport wasn't invented by a modern corporation. It was built 2,000 years ago in Rome. And when you put an ancient gladiator's oath next to a modern UFC contract, the paperwork is almost identical. Rome ran organized fighting as a business for roughly 650 years, longer than the United States has existed, more than twice over. But the emperor wasn't the one recruiting fighters, training them, or booking the next show. That job belonged to somebody else, somebody the movies never bother casting and Rome never put on a coin. He was called a lanista, owner, trainer, and manager of a stable of fighters, a familia gladiatoria, that he bought, trained, and rented out to whoever was staging the next show. Officially, Roman law branded him infamous, disreputable, legally dumped in the same bucket as the men he owned. Not exactly the title you'd put on a business card. Unofficially, senators quietly put money into gladiator schools because there was real profit in owning the guy who owns the fighters. Historians have traced an actual gladiator market operating under Rome's nose the entire time. He also picked the matchups. A gladiator didn't request rematches or turn down a bad style clash without consequences. The lanista set the card, the same way a matchmaker sets tonight's main event. Refuse the fight he picked, and you didn't fight. Didn't fight, didn't eat. Swap the toga for a headset, and you've basically just described Dana White's job. He's not the emperor. He was never supposed to be the story. He's the manager, and his profit depends on how little of the money the fighters take home. Rome had already worked out that arrangement fine, for everybody except the guy in the arena. Here's how it actually worked. A free Roman man could volunteer to become a gladiator, not a slave, a citizen. Choosing this. To do it, he signed something called an auctoramentum, a legal contract with the lanista. The oath that came with it wasn't symbolic. He swore it on these exact words: to be burned, bound, whipped, and killed by the sword if his owner ordered it. For the length of that contract, a free man legally handed his own body over to somebody else's decision. Now, nobody's whipping anybody in a UFC locker room. Let's be clear about that up front. The comparison isn't, it's literally the same, it's the same shape. Because a modern UFC contract still runs multiple fights deep, sometimes stretching years. You can't fight for anyone else while it's active. You can't take a boxing match without their sign-off. And if you actually win a title, the contract usually doesn't end. It extends automatically, because now you're worth more to them, not to you. Different oath, same idea. You don't own your own schedule until somebody else decides you've paid off the arrangement. And here's the detail that stings the most. A brand new gladiator, a novitius, often wasn't guaranteed real money at all beyond room, board, and training. He fought first to prove he was worth investing in, and only started seeing serious pay once the lanista decided he could sell tickets. Sound like anyone's first 3 fights on a regional card? Famous gladiators were genuine celebrities. Someone in Pompeii scratched graffiti onto a wall calling a gladiator named Celadus the girl's sigh. The guy had real fans. His face and his fights ended up on lamps, cups, and wall art sold across the empire. But the money that popularity generated didn't belong to him. It belonged to the school, to the lanista who owned his contract. Being famous and being paid for that fame were two completely different things. Sound familiar? In 2015, the UFC signed a 6-year, $70 million outfitting deal and banned fighters from wearing their own sponsor logos permanently. Before that, some fighters were pulling 6 figures a year from personal deals. After it, the promotion's entire sponsorship payout to every fighter across all 6 years combined added up to just over $39 million. One fighter, Vitor Belfort, put it bluntly at the time: "We are pretty much living in slavery." And it went further than logos. Slave gladiators didn't even fight under their own names. The lanista handed them single-word stage names, so the brand belonged to the school, not the man wearing it. A modern UFC fighter keeps his real name, but the company still owns the footage of every fight he's ever had. Walk away tomorrow, and you don't get to license your own highlight reel. Rome didn't need a contract clause to make sure the fame game stayed profitable for the owner instead of the fighter. It just needed the fighter to not own anything to begin with. Turns out, you don't need whips for that. You just need the paperwork. There's one more piece of this that Rome actually handled better, and it's not a small one. When a gladiator survived long enough, sometimes 5 wins, sometimes 20, depending on the era, he could be handled a rudis, a wooden training sword engraved with his name. It wasn't a trophy, it was a legal document. It meant his debt to the Lanista was settled, and nobody could put him back in that arena again unless he chose to walk back in himself. A slave who earned one stopped being a slave. A free man who earned one just walked away permanently with proof in his hand that the arrangement was over. The UFC doesn't have a rudis. There's no wooden sword, no piece of paper, no moment where the company says, your debt is paid, here's your retirement. No pension, no structured healthcare after the roster cut. A fighter's freedom is just the day his contract quietly expires and nobody calls to renew it. Rome built an actual off-ramp into a business run on human bodies. 2,000 years before workplace safety was a legal concept anywhere. The UFC, running that exact same business today, still hasn't gotten around to it. There's a phrase a Roman poet named Juvenal used to describe how the empire kept its population from asking harder questions. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses, free grain and free spectacle, handed out generously enough that nobody looked too closely at who actually held the power. The UFC doesn't hand out bread. It doesn't need to. It hands out $80 pay-per-views and knockout highlights, and the crowd doesn't spend much time asking who's collecting the gate. Same mechanism, different currency. Distraction was never a side effect of the show. It was always the business model. Rome's version of this business lasted roughly 650 years before it collapsed under its own weight. The UFC's version is about 30 years old, and it's still accelerating. The Colosseum is a ruin now, something tourists photograph on their way somewhere else. The Octagon is still selling out arenas every single month. Same show, new coat of paint. And the crowd still isn't asking who's collecting the gate. Rome, at least, handed you a sword when it was over. The UFC just stops calling.